this was round 5 of the U.S. Championship. I had 1 out of 4 going to the rest day. I had just lost to Lenderman with white. And the worst feeling on a rest day is that you lost the game before, thank you Justin Tess, and that you're playing Fabio with black with 1 out of 4 the next day. I was really down on myself for the majority of the rest day. But then toward the evening, I kind of got my wits about me. And I said, all right, let's prepare. Because the last time I played him in 2017, I played a French and I got blown off the board in 25 moves. I didn't prepare diligently. I mixed up my prep. And he blew me off the board. And I, at the very least, didn't want that to happen. I was determined to get a decent position with black out of the opening for once that tournament, after losing to Dariush and Ray essentially out of the opening. So I decided to pause all of the Sicilian and Alekhine shenanigans and go with what I know best, which is e4, e5. And Fabi has been playing the Rai Lopez almost exclusively in the last couple of months. So I didn't really prepare for much else, to be honest. I briefly looked at the Italian, but I was fully expecting the Rai Lopez, he plays it. I fluctuated here between several different possible variations. In the past, I'd mostly played the main line, a6, bishop a4, knight f6. Later against Dominguez, I played the Schliemann, which I also contemplated, but Fabi seemed to know it down pat. And then my eyes kind of settled on a line that I faced with the white pieces against Artemiev in aim chess. Thank you, Dolomite Baby. And that is called the deferred or the delayed Steinitz variation. Not the delayed Schliemann, the delayed Steinitz. The traditional Steinitz is to go d6 in this position, which is still considered a very solid move, but it's also very passive. It blocks the bishop, and black is worse here. The inclusion of a6, bishop a4 allows the extra option of b5, and that has many concrete benefits for black. One of which is that you get the famous Noah's Ark trap. If white plays d4 here, traditionally black has responded with b5, bishop b3, and now knight takes d4. And this is a trap that I'm sure almost everybody, or a lot of people in the audience probably know. Queen d4, and already black is winning with c5, and the bishop is going to be trapped. Queen d5, first you have to protect both the rook and the mate threat, so bishop b6, check, bishop d7, queen d5. Now the queen defends the rook, and you can go c4. Okay, so this is nothing to write home about. Obviously, Fabi knows not to play d4, and he decides to castle, which is one of the main lines, together with c3. And, okay, so bishop d7, following the sort of modern line that Artemiev has been playing, and a lot of people have been resorting to this line with black. Now, the funny thing is, if you turn on Stockfish here, at first it gives like 0.7 for white, which is a lot even for the Rai Lopez. But if you let it sit, and if you delve really deeply into these positions, you often find that that Stockfish kind of flounders here and doesn't propose particularly appealing ideas for white. So, for example, one very common thing that you will see, and even modern computers do this, I'm going to rewind in just a second, so I'm just trying to get to the appropriate positions. Here, for example, the chess.com engine is recommending as the top move d5. But as you guys can probably understand, this is maybe objectively better for white, but from a King's Indian perspective, it's kind of like a dream position. I'm already kind of poised to play f5. And I had no problem with this type of situation. So in these closed center type positions, the computer can still sometimes falter. Okay, so now let's go back to bishop d7. Against Artemiev, I think I played c4 here, kind of trying to get a Marozzi type position. It didn't go particularly well. And I think Fabi plays, objectively best line, which is c3, knight f6, and now very important move rook e1, because if white plays d4, then it turns out that black actually can take this pawn. And you get a forced line that results in a slightly better endgame for white, but I had analyzed that endgame very, very deeply, and I was confident that I would be able to hold a draw. So the line here goes rook e1, you drop the knight back, and basically you get liquidation, so d5, d5, bishop c6, queen d8, Now rook d8 walks into kind of a potential x-ray, so you play king d8, knight e5, bishop d5. At this point, there are, let me see. Yeah, at this point, there are in the database about 10 games, 7 games, including Nepo against Artemiev. And by the way, both bishop e8 and bishop d5 here I think are good moves. And it's like a 0.3 type advantage because white's got a bit of a clamp here and the king is weak. But ultimately, black consolidates due to the two bishops. I was not worried about this. I didn't think Fabi would burn his bridges like this, right? And risk drawing the game. Because he'd been struggling this tournament so far. And indeed, to my non-surprise, he goes rook e1. And now g6. So this is the whole idea behind black's setup. Steinitz often played bishop e7 in these positions, but this is tremendously passive. I mean, you can just see bishops on e7 and d7 like this is not the way modern players tend to play. And there's nothing super wrong with this. It's just too passive. The modern treatment is to play g6 and kind of play it King's Indian style, fianchetto the bishop. Now, black is a little bit behind on development on the king's side, but it turns out after d4, bishop g7, that tactically everything is justified here. Once again, bishop c6 and de might look very appetizing. But black simply takes the pawn on e4. And on the next move, black is going to castle. And even if white takes on d6, you still castle. This occurred in Karyakin against Artemiev. And black has excellent compensation for the pawn. So against Artemiev. Artemiev won that game. It's equal, but the rooks are coming to d8 and e8. I mean, you can see, you don't even need to calculate to understand that black has full compensation here for the pawn. And there's nothing else that white can do here. Some of you tactically minded people might notice this idea, but the problem when you fork a bishop is that the bishop is capable of saving both itself and the other forked piece. You bring it back to c6. And this was all part of my prep. Fabi, also knew this. He was still in his theory. And so he plays knight b to d2, developing. And please feel free to ask questions. Thank you, Pat, even, and clarify stuff. If I'm going too fast, I'm happy to repeat whatever needs repeating. I'm not going to do this twice, so please feel free. So knight b d2, and here comes a moment that I was really proud of. This is not a novelty by any means, but, it almost is a novelty. Actually, there are only 3 games in the database with the move that I played here. And by transposition, after my next move, there's only 4 games in the database, and I'm the only sort of GM game. We end up transposing on the 11th move to a more popular line, which has about 30 games, but still very uncommon. The most common move, as you guys might probably guess, is just to castle. And we get, this kind of structure. Generally, the bishop drops back to c2 to solidify the center. And I think white is slightly better here. But having left the computer on for a long time, I discovered that there's a very interesting and seemingly anti-positional idea. You take on d4. Now, what are we doing? Aren't we just yielding the center? Isn't this the whole point not to do this, right? Well, that's what it may seem like visually, but it turns out that because of the slight awkwardness, I think, of white's coordination, black has all these sudden tactical ideas that allow me to put super significant pressure on white's center. Thank you, Oli, correct. What ideas are those? Well, first of all, it's not so easy for white to make a move because the bishop on c1 is hemmed in by the knight. And I had a game like this earlier today, I think. The typical Rai Lopez move is knight f1. But does anybody remember how black can pounce in this position? And if you are a experienced Rai Lopez player, you will notice that what's very alarming about white's position is that he hasn't played h3. That's often punishable. What do I mean by anti-positional? It violates sort of what seems to be basic positional principles, one of which is that you don't give up control of the center unless you have to. So that's all that I really mean. So how do we punish white for not playing h3? So bishop g4 is fine. But it's better to start with b5, just get this bishop out of our hair, then go bishop g4, and you've got super nasty pressure going on this d4 pawn. I mean, if white plays h3, you take the knight, and queen cannot capture. White has to ruin his pawn structure, and that's a big problem. So it's just not easy to hold everything together. Bishop e3 is the continuation that has occurred most frequently, and now you don't take on e4 in these positions. This is a classic trap. But instead, you reroute this knight from a5 to c4, and then the c pawn goes. Black's got a great position here. I was kind of hoping that he would go for it, but Fabi, for a reason, he goes h3. Well, again, people saying that this is too complex. I mean, again, if you can isolate specifically the things I'm saying that aren't making sense, you can ask them, and I'm happy to clarify. But hopefully, there isn't anything crazy going on so far. All right. So white has played h3, but now we have to try to find a way to exploit the drawback of the positioning of the bishop on a4. And still remember that the bishop on c1 is as yet undeveloped. So one of the things you can notice about this position is the d3 square is a bit of a sore spot in white's position, and that's exactly where we aim with our knight. Just go knight b4. Looks a little bit artificial, but in fact, after bishop takes d7, queen takes d7, it turns out that it's not so easy to defend against all of these annoying threats. Knight is coming to d3. How can white defend that square? Well, again, knight f1 is the typical prescription, but because we've moved the knight away from c6, now the c pawn gets free. Black starts to contest the center. This is approximately equal according to the computer, but I really like black's position here. It's kind of like a Benoni on steroids almost. Okay, that should make sense. I mean, if white plays d5, black can just play c4 and forcibly drive the knight into d3. Hey, Amanda. Black is already better. So Fabi does not play knight f1. He plays queen b3, still part of my prep. This move stops black's ideas in my tracks. I can't play knight d3. And going back to c6 would be a huge buzzkill. So first things first, we support the knight. Fabi kicks it away. And only now do we go back to c6. Now, you might be thinking at this point, well, what is the purpose of going knight b4 and then back to c6? Well, we have accomplished two things in doing so. First of all, white can't take the pawn because rook f8 traps the queen. So that's out of the question. Number one is that we've traded light-squared bishops. Who does this benefit? Well, I believe that it benefits black because white's light-squared bishop, when it sits on c2, supports the e4 pawn. Now the e4 pawn is a little bit tender. And, you know, as I've beaten you over the head with, the dark-squared bishop is pretty lame at the moment. The third thing that we've gained is this structure with the pawns on a5 and a3 is in black's favor as well. And as you'll see in just a little while, I can play the move a4 and sort of freeze white's queenside. I'm sure you've seen this idea before in other openings. If white plays a4, then the b4 square is weakened and my knight is poised to occupy it. So Fabi goes knight f1, which is the first move that I had not looked at in my preparation. I had only looked at the concrete d5, which actually has occurred in 5 games. Knight f1 has occurred in 3 games, including mine. Now there's a very important detail. Knight comes back to b8. And the consequence of d5 is that our bishop is now open, and the c5 square has become a big weakness. This knight is going around through a6 to c5. We sack the pawn. We go to a6, and then on the next move, we go knight c5 with massive compensation for the pawn. I mean, again, if you just look at this position, visually, it's not so hard to determine that black has great comp. Yeah, it's still prep. I was really determined to do a good job with my prep this game. This has occurred 3 times, and there's 1 high-level correspondence game, 1 grandmaster game, and black is in great shape. And also the b file. If you play the Benko Gambit, I mean, this is like a fantasy. All right. So this did not happen, and Fabi was probably out of his prep at this point. Maybe he'd studied this at some point in the past, but probably didn't remember it. He was already taking his time. And he decides finally to go with this move, knight f1. But now, as I indicated, because we have this situation, maybe like 3 hours, I mean, nothing insane, but it was just very effective because I kind of predicted the right lopez. I go a4. Again, taking is impossible. So he drops the queen back to d3, and at this point we are on our own. The next move didn't take me a long time because it's a very natural follow-up to the previous move, a4. What does this move do? It freezes white's pawns. It also creates a stronghold on b3. What should go onto that square? Well, generally knights go to outposts, so knight a5 is a very typical move. Fabio responds with bishop g5. Okay, finally developing his bishop. I get my knight into b3, and he goes rook a d1. So he allows this knight to sit on the outpost, but now white has gotten all of his pieces essentially into the game. But I was happy with the outcome of the opening. My pieces are also all in the game. The position is just very complicated and probably about equal. Maybe a little bit better for white, but not convinced of that. Okay, so I was annoyed by the bishop, so I decided to tickle it with h6 and just see where he wants to put it. To my surprise, he takes the knight on f6. I didn't expect that. I thought he would move the bishop back, but okay. This is not a game-deciding moment. It's possible. He decides to trade. Why did he decide to trade? My guess is that on bishop e3, he might have been concerned about something like d5. e5, knight e4. This is a typical idea. Maybe he didn't like the look of this and decided to eliminate the knight while he had a chance. And now he decides to eliminate the other knight while he has a chance, knight 1 to d2, getting rid of this outpost. And this next move that I played is not technically the computer's top move. The computer just kind of suggests knight takes d2. What I didn't like about this position is that I saw that white has this plan of starting to push his center pawns f4 and e5. And I felt like if he drives that wedge into my position, the bishop might get lame. That knight, on the other hand, has access to a lot of key squares potentially. So maybe back to c4 or then later to e3. I felt like the knight could be better than the bishop here. I know that sounds surprising because right now the bishop is quite good, but if white drives this pawn wedge in, you have to look at the long term here. Okay, well, I don't have the edge. This is equal. I mean, no, the computer just, I don't really know the reason. The move that I played isn't really a mistake. It's slightly not preferred over the other move. Knight back to a5. This move took me a while. It took me maybe 10 minutes or so. You could check the timestamps on ChessBomb. And I think maybe at this point he started to get a little bit surprised because I was playing very combatively. I wasn't simplifying. What was the logic behind this move? Actually quite simple. First of all, I'm forcing this knight to remain on f3, which means that he cannot push f4. And e5 in a position like this is far less effective because I can simply take it. And there's no f pawn to recapture with. You can't capture the d pawn because the queen is hanging. It turns out, as I found out after the game, that in this position, white does have a pretty powerful resource that maybe was the way for white to get an edge. Does anybody see it? Has to do with the undefended nature of the bishop on f6. I've shown this type of idea before. This is not a difficult move once you look at this position. Yeah, knight e4. Knight comes out to e4. The queen is now defended. After bishop g7, knight takes e5 comes in. And the knights are very strong, so black potentially can simplify. But the idea of knight f6 and rook d7, I think, gives white maybe a slight advantage, according to the engine. Black should be able to make a draw, though. So this might have been a more practical path than what he did, which is knight b1. There's this cat and mouse game going on, right? He allows my knight to get back to b3, but he doesn't really care about that. What's more important to Fabi is to get his d2 knight into the game with knight c3. Maybe not, Gabu. I'm not sure. That position requires more analysis. I didn't like this scenario because I felt like the knight wasn't doing enough to warrant allowing white to coordinate his pieces. So I thought it was quite important here to create a net with my pawns in order to limit the mobility of this b1 knight. And that's where I came up with my next idea, which is to play b5 number 1, and after knight c3, which he didn't play, to play knight c4. And it turns out that I have yet another outpost on the queen side. That's the perk of having a superior pawn structure. And then once his queen moves back, let's say to c2, or however he wants to defend b2 pawn, I go c6, and the knight on c3 has been sort of fully restricted. I'm controlling d5. Everything is defended. All the pawns defend each other. We're Gucci here. This is good. This is a good position. Something similar happened in the game by transposition. Okay, so I think, well, knight c3, knight c4. It's not easy to play knight d2 because once he plays rook e2, knight d2 actually blocks the rook's coverage of the pawn. So not so simple for white to untangle here, believe it or not. Knight d5 is possible, but doesn't do much. I just drop my bishop back and then play c6. So Fabi goes queen c2, which is, I think, a nice move. He's kind of waiting for me to go knight c4 and then says, gotcha. I go knight bd2 and I get your knight out of c4. Notice how he doesn't commit to the placement of the b1 knight. He waits for me to put my cards on the table and show where I want to put the knight. Of course, I don't show where I want to put the knight. I don't play into his hands. Yeah, so now e5 is also quite a nasty idea because it hits the bishop. So I play a prophylactic move. I drop my bishop back to a safer square, taking the sting out of the move e5, which now doesn't come with tempo and can be easily dealt with. Okay, so he goes knight c3, and I go c6 as planned. I'm not in a hurry to put this knight on c4. It's not going anywhere. If he tries to bring the other knight to d2, he loses d4 pawn. I think you can kind of see how the lack of bishops is hurting white's control over his set. It looks like white's got all his pieces where he wants them, but somehow white's stuck in a little bit of molasses. Thank you, Nauseous Maximus. So at this point, Fabi took a long time. I mean, he was taking like 10, 15 minutes on each move, and he started to get himself into a little bit of time pressure. This is hour and a half for 40 moves, and then an additional 30 minutes. So at this point, I would say he had about 35 minutes left. I had maybe 45 minutes. And Fabi decides to sort of change the arc of the game. He goes e5. All right. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the pawn break is not as dangerous with the bishop now hiding on g7, but it still is dangerous. I mean, if I'm not careful, I'm going to be caught with my pants down here. So to this end, I think that the instinctual move for a lot of people here would be to play d5. But now the bishop is totally hemmed in, and white has a very simple plan of preparing e6. You can get this knight from e2 to f4, and then e6 is essentially going to be unstoppable. So a lot of people have this knee-jerk reaction to move the pawn forward, but in this case, it's bad. Another knee-jerk reaction is to take on e5. This was possible. I didn't want to give white an open d-file. So I decided to sort of leave everything as it is in the center, just focus on improving my position, and take the sting out of the potential idea of e6. So I played rook f e8. Why would the e6 pawn break be so good? Sure, so let's analyze a hypothetical scenario. Let's say black puts the knight on c4, white puts the knight on f4. What's so great about e6? It's the fact that the g6 pawn becomes a tremendous weakness, right? If black's pawn was on h7, I would not be so worried about it. As it stands, once the knight sinks its teeth onto g6, there's going to be trouble. I'm not saying that black is losing. Also, this knight from f4 can reroute through d3 to c5, potentially. So whatever, let's say rook a b8. E6, f e6, knight g6, and black's position starts to fall apart at the seam. And look at this incredibly weak square. Look at the king. It's not good, all right? And you can argue that black can defend, but it's not fun to play such positions. Black has no plan. So rook f e8, that's where it stems. But Fabi plays knight e4, very natural move. And again, he's tempting me into committing the placement of the d-pawn, but still I don't do that. I go knight c4, which is a very important move, defending the pawn on d6 and finally getting that knight where it wants to be. And here the game enters, I would say, out of the positional stage and into the tactical stage. Right, so far, there's been a lot of maneuvering. We've been positioning our pieces on, what we believe to be the best squares. Now, things kind of explode. They explode because Fabi decides on e takes d6. What is Black's plan? Well, Black's plan is to eventually take on e5. I mean, if White procrastinates for too long, I am going to take on e5 and then try to win that e-pawn. Okay, so let's make a random move. Here, after de, de, queen f5, for instance, there's already a pin going on. This pawn on e5 is now a huge weakness. So I want to make something clear, which is that earlier I didn't want to take that pawn because it would give White control of the d file. But now there's become, the circumstances have changed, and there's something more important, which is that I can now win the c5 pawn, and that warrants something that I wouldn't do earlier, if that makes sense. You're constantly assessing and reassessing key ideas to see if the circumstances have changed and if they're now possible. And you got to keep doing this at this level, I think. Otherwise, you miss opportunity. So ed, knight d6. Looks like Black's chilling. I mean, if White captures, this is great for us. Now the bishop is good. We've got a nice little outpost on d5. But, of course, as many of you guys know, who saw the game, Fabi has a very concrete idea, which is knight e5. This looks really, really scary. Because taking is out of the question. Everything just collapses instantly. We have to move the queen, but where can we move it? Well, it's not so clear. We presumably have to move it somewhere so that we preserve contact with the knight, right? So queen c7 might seem like the only move. But here simply White wins a pawn. Knight takes d6, queen takes d6, and knight takes c6. And I was calculating this at first and getting discouraged because after takes, you might briefly be tempted by rook c8, but knight e7 ends the game here. And bishop takes d4 might seem like an equalizing move, but it's not. Everything is hanging in the air, and the move queen e4 decides the game because it x-rays the rook, threatens knight e7, and threatens the bishop. So this is losing. For Black, I calculated this, and of course I had seen this idea when I played knight c4, so I knew what I was going to do here. And who can remind me of the key move without which, without this move, I would have lost the game. This is a key defensive idea. And that is not queen takes h3. You're on the right diagonal. It's queen to f5. That's right. Creating a pin against the knight. Very important resource. Okay, he can't take. He can't really take on c6 either because there's a pin and the knight on e4 is under pressure. In fact, there's a nice line. Queen c6, knight e4, queen e4. Looks like White has gotten out of the woods, but this very unassuming move f6 actually wins the knight. That is a nice little detail. But Fabi kind of has to go full steam ahead. He has to get rid of this queen, and that's why he plays g4. But obviously this is a significant weakening of the king. And now I drop my queen back to e6. And here Fabi took, another 15 minutes, getting himself down under 10 minutes, which was, that ended up being kind of disastrous for him. And he spent all this time calculating the key line, which is knight d6, queen d6, knight c6. How has the move g4 changed the landscape of the position? Yeah, I saw g4. Well, if we go back through the initial line that we were calculating, recall that queen e4 used to be the winning move. I was so happy when I saw this. Remember, now White has played g4. Does this allow any additional resources? It does. Queen g3 check is not only a saving grace, but also just wins the game for Black. This is the key, because this move now comes with check, and everything falls. So bishop d4 is fine for Black. Now Fabi should have gone for this because I think he might have stopped calculating here. If he went a little bit further, he would have seen that after takes, White has a tremendously nasty move here. When it seems like Black is totally out of the woods, does anybody see it? What is the idea that maybe he missed or he underestimated? And it's a queen c6, forking the rook and the pawn. Well, no problem. Black defends with rook b8. But boom, comes rook e8 check. forcing the trade. And amazingly, white returns, takes the pawn, defends b2. Now, I had calculated to this point and concluded that this should be a draw. The reason I came to that conclusion is that the king is really weak, A. And B, remember, all a while ago I played a4, and now I reap the rewards of that move because white, I don't think, has any way to ever really create a passed pawn. I mean, if white plays b3, that's only asking for trouble due to queen d1. I don't think the king can evacuate itself to anything resembling a safe position. Every time it goes up to g2, boop, check on e4. There's nowhere to run, and computer confirms that, you know, this is like 0.8. White has maybe some attempts, but it should be a draw with careful play. b4, again, queen a1, queen takes a3. There's always going to be some fork. It's possible that Fabi calculated this and concluded that there were not enough winning chances, and I think he simply underestimated the danger. So having calculated this, he rejects it, and he decides instead to go back to c3. This is where I pounced. This is where I recognized that he was starting to lose control of the game. Knight c3 is a big mistake. So first things first, we defend the c pawn. Knight burying ideas of knight takes c6. He can't do that because of queen takes e1 check, and we take everything here. Okay, does that make sense? Now he can go back with his knight, and you know he did that ultimately, but that doesn't do anything. Right? We can just move the queen. Instead, Fabi goes rook e2, so he's clearly putting the rook on a defended square, and now he threatens knight takes e6. But here I made perhaps the most important move of the game. I had seen this idea a while back. I had seen this idea when I played queen e6. And again, I'm reaping the rewards of the placement of the a pawn. That pawn on a4 creates a stronghold on b3. Now, I used to put a knight there, but now the circumstances have changed, and I put my queen on b3, queen b3. And this essentially forces a queen trade. I mean, the pressure that the queen exerts is immense. So Fabi takes. Now this pawn on b3 is a monster. It's very hard to attack. And if, God forbid, white loses the b2 pawn, well, and this pawn is going to be 2 steps away from promotion, not to mention the fact that the bishop is a beast. This knight is poised to go on to c4. And white's position really starts coming apart here. In addition, he's in big time pressure. He's got 10 minutes for 10 moves. So Fabi tries to glue things together. He brings his king up to g2. Sort of, not really a waiting move, but improving his position, kind of asking me what I'm going to do next. But I did not let him breathe. We got to break through white's position. So c5 to eliminate the key d4 pawn. D takes c5. Now another very important move. Now, I was tempted by rook takes c5, which I calculated and concluded that it led to a draw. Takes, let's say rook takes c5. But here, for instance, white could play rook e to d2, and I don't think there's anything impressive for black. You can move the rook back, threatening bishop c3. Not a problem. White moves the knight back, and I don't think we can really get to that b2 pawn in any realistic way. It's too well protected. Too well protected. This is probably a draw. And at this point, I was already sensing that this might be an opportunity to play the game of my life. So instead, I keep my eyes on the prize, which is that, you know, we need to use the pawns and pieces at my disposal to remake the position in my favor. And that's where I found the move knight to c4. And this was, according to the engine, the decisive mistake by Fabi. It's quite telling that he played the next move almost instantly. He assumed that it was forced, and I'll tell you something else. I assumed that it was forced. We both assumed that white has to take that knight, because how could you leave a monster like this on c4? But you flip on the engine and you see that white had one chance to draw the game. And amazingly, it's the move knight d3, and it's insane. I'm not totally convinced that it's a draw. I haven't looked at it on a high def. But basically, the engine gives this crazy line. First of all, if you take on e2, and then you take on b2, and at the end of the line, white's going to have not rook b1, because after bishop takes a3, rook takes b3, there's a very powerful move b4, and c5 pawn is going to be lost. But can anybody spot a really powerful drawing idea that white has here? There's two moves that are kind of similar in nature. It's not rook d3 either, because that's exactly the same thing as rook b1. Rook d5 doesn't defend the pawn, though. It's not rook d2. Again, you guys have to realize that if the bishop takes the pawn and then we advance this pawn to b2, the game is over. c6, I'll simply take it. Yes, knight c1 is correct. Or knight d4. Knight moves backwards to hit the pawn. If we take it, it's a draw. I mean, the rook comes to b1 and there's mass liquidation. And if we play rook takes c5, then knight takes b3, rook c3, and knight d4 hitting the pawn and saving the game. If bishop takes a3, this is not a good move. Then after knight takes b3 already, white is better because you can't take on c5 due to rook c1. Incredible lines here, and it appears that knight d3 would have saved the game. Bishop takes c3 is another try, by the way, and evaluating this position correctly is also really, really hard. I mean, this looks so scary. There's rook d8, there's b2. I'll spare you, the details. I still have to analyze this, but I think it's a draw. But of course, Fabi, I mean, this didn't occur to either of us. And so he takes on c4, and this is essentially the decisive. Well, this and the next move form the decisive mistakes. Rook takes c2, and again, he plays instantly knight takes c2, foregoing perhaps the last chance to muddy the waters, which was this intermezzo knight d6. Bishop takes c3 because both rooks are hanging. Knight takes c8, bishop takes b2, and black probably should win this game, but the engine gives white some pretty decent chances to draw. Okay, I'm not sure people are actually interested in the game. I want to make sure that I'm making sense and that people are following. Or we're drawing near the end here. Okay, good. All right. So yeah, just needed some positive reinforcement. So knight takes c2. Okay, great, thanks. Just wanted to make sure. B takes c4, and currently black is down a pawn, but here's the whole problem. This pawn on b2 is essentially indefensible in the long run. And the configuration that I've gotten here is extremely beneficial because I've got also the potential to go c3 at some point and break through. If I take on b2 and I get two connected passers, the game is over. The game is over immediately. So he cannot allow the b2 pawn to be captured scot-free. And that's why Fabi goes rook c1. Counterattacking the pawn on c4. Okay. Rook takes b2. Rook takes c4. Bishop takes a3. Hitting the pawn on c5. And he goes c6. This stretch we played very, very quickly. These moves are all essentially forced. b2 and knight c3. And this is the last critical moment of the game. Now, as luck would have it, it's move 39. I've got about 10 minutes. And I used almost all of them to find the winning idea. Now, it doesn't seem visually that it's not clear how to evaluate this position because the pawn on b2 could potentially be lost, and then you would have potentially mutually assured destruction, right? You would take on c6 and white would take on b2. But I correctly diagnosed the why not rook c1 before bishop b2. Not sure where you're asking that. I mean, rook c1 is, I mean, he could go rook d2 also, but this forces white into complete passivity and the rook is tied down to the pawn. This is not a good defensive scheme. So rook c1 is correct. I think it's the best option. So the whole problem here is that the bishop on a3 is super misplaced. It doesn't seem to be misplaced at first because it seems to be quite well placed. It's defending the pawn. The problem is it's not doing anything else and it's very easy to attack. Knight b1, rook a4. The bishop on a3 is highly problematic. And as soon as I understood that, I spotted the correct maneuver. You could do this in many different ways. Bishop b7, bishop f6. I decided on bishop f8 just to be safe. Transferring the bishop to g7 where it's going to be A, defending the pawn, B, unassailable, and C, essentially creating an unstoppable bind against white's position. This is the only winning idea. So Fabi can do anything he wants. He goes knight b1 to g7. The knight is now tied down to the pawn. And the key difference is that this pawn, as we have said already, is invincible. But white's pawn on c6 is not invincible because I can simply bring the king up to d6 and then win the pawn. And if I win the pawn, the game is over immediately. So this was move 40. 30 minutes have been added to the clock. Fabi spent almost all of them on the next couple of moves. And it dawned on both of us at this point that the game is essentially over. Now, white has one last attempt to, to stop what seems to be the inevitable, and that is to use the king to block black's king's path to d6. That is to get this king to d5. But this is where I did the brunt of my calculation, and I showed this in the post-game press conference. That king is now vulnerable, and we can use that vulnerability to get this rook around to d1. Rook d8, king c5, and rook d1. And all that needs to be established here is that the c-pawn does not afford white sufficient counterplay. c7, but the king slides in to stop the pawn. King b6, again threatening to promote, but the king goes back to c8. And here a very important line. I was terrified when I first spotted this. White can go rook a4. And rook can come to a8. But somehow we have to find a way to dislodge this king so that we can take the pawn. In comes the bishop. In comes the rook. The king maintains contact with the pawn. And here there is relatively prosaic idea. You go bishop c5 check. Okay, the king cannot abandon the pawn. It has to go back to c6. Now we grab the pawn on f2. And why did we grab that pawn? Not just to win a pawn, but rather to transfer the bishop to g3. And finally, the king has to relinquish its grip of the pawn, which means that we can now take the knight, because rook a8 is met with king takes c7. This is not the only win, by the way, but it's the cleanest. It's the cleanest. Why not rook e6 after rook a4? Yeah, rook d6 is also possible, but after king c5, there's a super nasty detail. If you take the pawn, you get checked on a7, and this leads to very unclear consequences. Of course, black is not losing, king b8, but I mean, rook f7, probably black is still winning, but it's super, it's unnecessary complications. So this was one very nice line. Another very nice line was rook e4 check in this position. White can try this, and then king b6. Trying to get the king onto a vulnerable spot. And after rook b1, c7, you don't want to go king c8 and get checkmated. But here, it might seem that white can go rook e7 and promote. If you calculate a little bit further, you notice that all black needs to do is move the rook away and then escape the checks. All of that's easy to do. And black can do that in many different ways. Rook c1 is probably the simplest. Check, king e6, check, bishop b5, no more checks, and the pawn promotes. Pawn promotes. So we were both calculating all of this. I was calculating this when I played bishop f8. He was calculating this presumably here, and this is all computer verified. It's lost. And Fabi, out of desperation, he goes h4. I mean, he's trying to basically trade king side pawns and try to liquidate, but it's not going to work. I have too many pawns on the king side, and that's it. It's over. I win the pawn, and then I essentially go after the knight. Rook b4, rook takes c6. Goes rook b7, a couple final moves, get the bishop out of the danger zone. And now I spotted the easiest win. First we go rook c2, hit the knight. Knight can't stray too far from the b1 square. Otherwise I go king c6, and the rook simply does not have any squares on the b file. So king e3 to support the knight, and now king c6, the winning move. Okay, the rook has only one square, which is b3. If he goes rook b4, he gets forked. If he moves the rook away from the b file, we take on d2 and promote. But after rook b3, I can now slide my rook to c3, trade rooks, and simplify into an even easier win. Bishop b4. The knight is totally stalemated, and I have perfectly positioned pawns, which allows me at the right moment to create a passer with h5, and white is overwhelmed trying to stop both of them. f4, king d5, avoiding h5, which leads to unnecessary complications due to f5. Notice how he plays, even with one piece left, he still finds a way to set a trap, which is quite an incredible ability. But it's over. King d5, we stop f5, and only now do I go h5. f5, now we take, and we drop the king back to e6 to stop the pawn. King e4, g3, and bishop d6. hooking the bishop to the pawn. The winning plan is simply to take this pawn and then to slowly but surely walk the king all the way back to a2. And if white's king tries to help, then you push the g-pawn at the right moment. So he resigned here. And that's the game. I mean, you know, that's just how it happens. He made a couple of critical mistakes in key moments, and really it was only one mistake. I think the move that ultimately ended up turning the tide in my favor was knight c3. I honestly think this is what did him in. Not going for this risk-free continuation up a pawn, probably because he judged that it was too drawish. That's ultimately, I think, what turned the tides, and at that point he sort of never recovered. When did you get a sense that you were going to win? I got that feeling when I played bishop f8. When I spotted this idea, I started to understand that very high likelihood that white is simply lost here with no hope. And at that point I was completely zeroed in, more focused than I've ever been, because you know you can't screw up such an opportunity. You just can't allow that to happen. But I hope you guys enjoyed. I mean, this is a very complex game, a lot more to talk about, a lot more I could talk about, but I want to keep this pretty compact, so I appreciate everybody paying such careful attention. No reason. Bishop e7 was fine. Bishop d6 would allow f4. There's no reason to play with fire here. So you want to drop it back as far, you know, as you want to go as close as possible to your camp, basically. Yeah, thank you. Well, I'll definitely address the other games on future streams. For now, I'm going to call it a night, guys. Have a great rest of your night, and thanks again for the support.